This is Whispering to Nandanakanana by Narul Thompson. King Shakib had everything a man of his time would covet. A palace that reached the stars, a bursary that was brimming with the bounties of his predecessors, and a library that imparted wisdom from those who ruled before him. He was married to a queen that sifted the beauty of the world into the palm of his hand. She bore him 3 daughters, strong in their own unique facets, and the people of his kingdom showed no signs of insurrection throughout his reign. In his public chambers, prophets came to tell him of the great fortunes he would continue to have, and storytellers wove him tales that celebrated his grandeur. Yet while everything seemed well, if not perfect, there was anguish within King Shakib's soul. The kingdom of which he inherited was lost within the heart of a lush forest. In all his life there had been no travelers, and those who had left never came back among even a whisper. There were thousands within the society which lived to serve him, and there wasn't anything that the kingdom ever needed. There were no struggles in the lives of his people. Most had never felt possessed to leave as a result. His storytellers told tales that came from within the compounds of the community, and never tried to challenge his beliefs. The prophecies that were shared with him never revealed of impending doom, just the same predictions of bountiful crops, followed by eventual acclaim from his people. He was devastated upon realizing that all 3 of his daughters never defied him in any way throughout their adolescence, and he was content with every pursuit they ended up thriving within. Even his queen never showed an ounce of bitterness towards him, despite being the result of an arranged marriage. Yet what shattered King Shakib's being was the realization that the people of his kingdom had been here before him all the same, and that his society would remain the paradise it had been after he died. King Shakib recognized that the story of his life would sit neatly beside the ones of kings before him, another volume in an expanse of kings ruling without conflict or consequence. This troubled King Shakib, and he decided that at night, after the kingdom's Eid al-Fitr festival, a celebration of the end of Ramadan, he would open to his queen about his predicament. In their chambers after the festivities, he sat on the edge of the bed with a furrowed brow, thinking of how he would express his crisis. His queen was drained by the proceedings, but was eager to share her own dialogue. She had elaborated how the future of his lineage seemed golden, exclaiming that the oldest, Amelia, impressed the kingdom with her athletic prowess, not losing a single match of Bhutan during the festival's competition. She then revered that their middle child, Alavi, had concocted a sweet and savory iteration of sheer kurma to the acclaim of the many breaking their arduous fast. Lastly, she recounted that their youngest girl, Shabrina, had recited her recently written story of the kingdom's prosperity in front of a crowd of hundreds, who erupted in applause by the end of the tale. As she was relaying the night to him with her own passion, King Shakib studied her face. And while throughout their years together, she had never verbalized the words, "I love you," she expressed those words through her luminous gaze. It was then that King Shakib had decided he would never articulate his dilemma. It eventually came time for King Shakib to die, and as was accustomed, a biographer came to record the story of his life. Shakib described the various facets of his simple ruling. His people were kind, and he was kind to them. His queen loved him, and as such, he loved her. His daughters were proud of the father they had, and he was proud of the women they had become. His troubled look and lost gaze, both of which had become synonymous with Shakib, remained within his final moments. The years, among other things, had taken their toll, and he was restless within death. For the next 5 days, the people of Shakib's kingdom held a ceremony for him. During the festivals of food and entertainment, the queen did not participate in either, for she was struck with grief when recounting the memories of her late husband. She thought of the few times he would smile at her, how it had given her all of the purpose she needed in life. She always wondered what he was thinking of, and always prepared to ask each night. She never inquired, and intrinsically realized she will never know what caused his suffering. It was then that the queen felt the warm embrace of a single tear across her cheek. Amelia spent those 5 days pushing herself through rigorous Bhutan exercises. Typically, these regimens left her exhausted and gasping for breath. This time was different since Amelia was exercising Bhutan's most important pillar, well-being. She sat silently in a closed room in her late father's palace, a commodity which she would soon have to part with. Without distractions, she sat silently, processing the death of her father through a meditation ritual that she had been taught since the beginning of her forays into Bhutan. She had rewound the life experiences she shared with her father repeatedly in her head. He would come into the room where she meditated, and she would become frustrated when he broke her concentration. He would monologue that while it was important to settle within one's thoughts, it was also important to share those feelings with others, especially with those that you love. She kept rewinding until the memories were malleable and could be reshaped into something less melancholy. However, she was still distraught by the images of her father's apprehension that plagued his later life. It was disheartening for her to think that she never thought to share with him how to process his own complications. Amelia was crippled away from her meditation and began to sob. No one came to her side. For Alavi, she was preparing dish after dish for the celebration. She made morag palau, her father's favorite dish for when he had been a child in his kingdom. It was a piece that balanced chicken, rice, and a savory yogurt sauce mixed with ghee. What followed was patla khichuri, a rice and lentil amalgamation that was cascaded with a lamb curry. It was a serving that her mother and father shared on the night of their wedding, and she had since made it for them to combat the rainy days of the monsoon. Lastly, the denizens helped themselves to her version of ras malai, consisting of flattened balls of cheese soaked in cream. As a child, her father would always coax her to try it. Alavi would protest out of fear for their taste. However, she eventually complied, with the dessert becoming the delicacy that inspired her to pursue her passion in culinary arts. It was within that last course, a symbol of her relationship with her father and the trust he provided, that she was finally able to reflect on how the people enjoyed the meals. She observed the smiling and ignorant faces of her father's people, and dread filled her body. She thought about how they were eating her father, consuming him without any ounce of reflection. As they laughed merrily, Alavi was overcome with fear. Shabrina was trying to write a story. She had intended to share it during the second day of the celebration. The words never came to her as they usually did. It was now the fourth day, and time was soon running out for her story's relevancy, as the celebration was going to soon draw to a close. She tossed stones into a lake that was in what used to be her father's courtyard. She studied the ripples as they dissolved, and thought about her ability to capture her father in a page would soon fade as well. Her lifetime as she was the youngest was almost entirely spent writing stories for him. The smiles of amusement he would impart when reading her pieces gave her the desire to continue writing. It was then that Shabrina realized that this was the missing ingredient to her stories, and she felt as if a great weight rested upon her, dragging her to the ground. Shabrina knew that she had to find anything that reminded her of his smile and raced to his chambers. Inside of what used to be her father's chambers were men already transporting his belongings. She clumsily bumped into one of them, and he dropped the vase he was holding. It shattered, and Shabrina apologized and promised she would clean up the mess. As the men continued to strip her father's chambers, she collected as many pieces as she could, discovering within the vase that there was a hidden scroll. She freed the scroll of its bindings and sat on the corner of what used to be her father's bed and began to read. If it any indication, I will die within a few days, if not tomorrow. Lest I should never be able to express in that time what has befallen me, I feel the need to write a few lines that will peer under the eyes of whomever it may concern. As a leader, I had no misgivings. There was only confidence in my ability to guide, and I never needed to tap into the wells of courage. Every day of my rule, I wished that a traveler would find our paradise within the forest. A selfish part of me even wished that he would challenge me, bring about a war that would give me the proper opportunity to distinguish myself as the best leader this kingdom ever had. I even thought of embarking on a journey myself to find another civilization who hopefully had dissenting ideas. I wanted to pursue the sanctity that came with solving problems and repairing mistakes but nothing had ever been broken in my dominion. And these were nothing more than fantasies, and I sacrificed the possible joys in my life and my legacy to be sure that the perfect society of which I ruled remained. I pray that I will be forgiven of these faults that tormented my mind, and the greed that came with wanting to be unconventional. What troubles me most is a realization that these thoughts are surely not unique to me. Forgive me, King Hussein. When Shabrina finished reading King Hussein's story, who had been dead for centuries, tears streamed from her eyes. Separating the grief that was inherited by the death of her father, Shabrina was decimated by the betrayal that came from assuming these were the dying words of her father. The anecdotes were more divine and beautiful than any passage she could conjure herself, and it had created an ache in the middle of her chest. It was an ache that she had felt for the first time in her life, and something she wished would go away and never come back. Shabrina knew now what her fate was to be. Many more years passed, and the kingdom was under a different rule. King Shakib's queen was no longer queen. Now she was merely known as Aloka, a widow who, while having taken care of her daughters, had the two strong women end up caring for her. By this time, many had forgotten about the legacy of King Shakib, had forgotten about Aloka's third daughter who went missing shortly after his death. They had always fixated on the present with no regard for the past. Yet the past still regarded the people of the kingdom, and it would soon come for the payment of debts. It started with militant rustling from the forest. The kingdom's barrier that had protected it from outsiders for years would soon be compromised. This reverberation surrounding the kingdom was comparable only to a heartbeat owed by a colossal monster. The people segregated on the outskirts of their commonwealth and prepared to greet the first visitors of their civilization. Emerging from the overgrowth were the celestial faces of a people that looked nothing as if those of the kingdom could have possibly imagined. They were of the same disposition of angels born of light. The newest ruler of the kingdom, King Batuk, came forward to the beings with a trembling composure. In front of his people, he fell to his hands and knees before the otherworldly figures, and the figures returned the favor with mocking laughter. King Batuk, however, misunderstood this gesture as validation. The divine host spoke in a language Batuk and his people were unable to understand, and they spoke of how the kingdom was truly the paradise that the girl described in her stories. Batuk had already sprang excitedly to greet the beings, with the same exuberance he had rehearsed should this day come. However, before he was able to utter a single word, time had slowed. Batuk had noticed a warm liquid pooling from his chest, followed by a sharp pain from the same area. This was juxtaposed by the loudest sound Batuk had heard in his entire life, and as he fell to the ground, he watched his people suffer the same affliction. As his blood cascaded the ground into crimson, he could only lay there and observe the gradually fading images of his kingdom enraptured by orange flames and a cacophony of screams. Tears were squeezed from his eyes as he realized there was nothing he could do to save his people. Safwan has many questions. He first asks the old man why the people couldn't have defended himself, then barrages him with the frustrated inquiries as to who the celestial beings were. Without pause, he then interrogates as to what happened to Shabrina and what her fate was. The old man stops the boy and interjects with questions of his own. Does Safwan have any more cigarettes? Does Safwan have any more coin? If not, then the time for stories are over. The old man compels him to get home. He informs him that night was coming, and his mother would soon worry about him. Safwan takes heed and leans on his makeshift crutch, beginning to take the shortcuts that are unique to that of a child. His single foot steps over a desert of bullet casings and broken glass. The rest of his environment an archive of garbage and a repository of the rubble of bombed-out buildings. Safwan eventually reaches his home despite the phantom pain of his missing leg and his constant pangs from hunger. It was easy for him to participate in Ramadan as food is hard to come by. Safwan lays on the floor of his home without a roof, and the rain trickles onto his face as he attempts to fall into as deep of a sleep as he can. He's not thinking of his many discomforts, nor the loneliness that comes with being the last living member of a family. Safwan's mind instead drifted to golden palaces. He thought of long hallways and a people that lived happy and carefree. He pondered on good food and great stories and celestial beings. He knew deep inside that someday he would find King Shakib's city lost in the forest. He would meet Ailoka and her daughters, and he would be a part of the family that was their society. Safwan would have everything a boy of his period could want.